It was a gray morning in Palermo, the kind of morning where the air hung heavy and thick with sea salt, where the sound of church bells and street vendors blended into a tired hum. The city had always carried two faces, one of beauty and one of quiet fear. The narrow cobblestone streets with their cracked walls and faded paint hid more than they revealed. Behind the markets, behind the whispers of neighbors, there were things no one spoke about. In a city ruled by invisible hands, silence was safety. The De Luca family's mansion sat high above the city on a hill that overlooked the coast. The building was massive, pale stone framed with tall cypress trees that swayed even when the air was still. To anyone outside, it was a symbol of power and wealth. To those who lived inside, it was a fortress and a cage. The house had more cameras than windows, more guards than guests. Even the laughter that sometimes came from inside seemed rehearsed, like the walls were listening. It was said that everything in Palermo moved through Don Salvatore De Luca, the man who made men disappear without a sound. He controlled shipping companies, construction firms, and banks, all of which were technically legal on paper, but everyone knew the truth. He didn't speak much in public. He didn't need to. When he entered a room, people lowered their eyes, and when he smiled, they wondered who would vanish next. But in private, behind his heavy oak doors, Don Salvatore was something else, a father. His only son, Matteo, was 12 years old, a quiet boy with eyes that always looked a little too old for his face. He was often seen with his tutor in the garden sketching in a small black notebook. He didn't talk much to the guards or the staff, but when he did, he was polite, soft-spoken, almost gentle. People said he had his mother's kindness, a quality his father's world couldn't afford. The boy was protected like a diamond. No one could get near him without permission. Yet inside that protection, Matteo lived a life that didn't feel like his own. Everything changed one morning in late autumn. The boy woke up screaming. The sound tore through the mansion like an alarm. By the time the guards rushed in, Matteo was shaking, his face pale, his body drenched in sweat. He said he couldn't see. Then he said he could. Then he didn't speak at all. Within hours, the city's top doctors were inside the house. They examined him under the golden chandelier of the dining hall, where the Don usually hosted his meetings. Machines were brought in, charts were drawn, and whispers grew heavier by the hour. The doctors couldn't agree on what was happening. Some said it was neurological, others said psychological. One of them dared to suggest it might be stress, and was never seen again inside the mansion. Days passed, then weeks. Matteo's condition worsened. He'd go from fever to cold. He'd scream at shadows no one else saw. He'd whisper things in his sleep, names, places, words that made the maids cross themselves. Don Salvatore's temper grew colder with every hour his son didn't recover. He brought in specialists from Rome, then from Berlin, then from New York. 100 doctors walked through that house. Each one promised an answer. None delivered. They all left with more fear than they came with. Some said the boy's illness was beyond science. Others refused to say anything at all. Inside the De Luca mansion, hope began to rot. The Don's wife, Elena, stopped leaving her room. She prayed at the small altar beside her bed, lighting candles until the wax formed rivers across the floor. The staff moved like ghosts. The air felt cursed. The boy's tutor stopped showing up, and the guards began whispering about bad omens. At night, some said they heard footsteps in Matteo's room when no one was there. The Don's men searched the mansion, then the grounds, then the church nearby, as if the illness itself was hiding somewhere that could be hunted down. But it was. It stayed inside the boy, invisible and cruel. Through it all, there was one man no one noticed much, the janitor. An old man named Carlo who'd worked there for almost 20 years. He was small, bent from years of sweeping and polishing, and always smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and tobacco. No one talked to him. He moved silently, mopping floors after the doctors left, cleaning up the messes no one else would touch. He saw everything, but no one saw him. He'd watch the doctors come and go. He'd watch the Don packing by the windows, glass of whiskey in hand, jaw tight. He'd watch the boy's door open and close, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. Carlo never spoke unless someone spoke to him first. He'd nod, keep his head down, and go back to his work. But something in the way Matteo's screams echoed through the hallways changed him. It was the sound of pain that didn't belong to a sickness. It sounded like fear. One night when everyone had gone to bed, Carlo stood outside the boy's room, mop in hand, listening. The house was quiet, but from inside the room he heard a whisper. Soft, broken, like the boy was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Carlo's hand tightened around the handle. He didn't know then why he stayed there for so long, just listening. Maybe it was because he'd once had a son too long ago, before this job, before the years took everything from him. Or maybe it was because something about this illness didn't feel natural. It felt wrong, like the sickness wasn't inside the boy, but around him. And in that moment, in the flickering light of the hallway, as the mansion slept under the weight of its secrets, Carlo whispered to himself the words that would change everything. I can. No one heard him, not yet, but soon they would. The days in the De Luca mansion began to stretch like shadows, long, heavy, and silent. The smell of medicine and fear hung in the halls. Doctors still came and went, though fewer now. Most refused to return after seeing the boy's eyes roll back in his head or hearing him scream words that didn't make sense. One muttered about exorcisms. Another said it was a curse, though he laughed nervously when he said it, as if trying to convince himself it was only a joke. But no one in that house was laughing anymore. Don Salvador's patience began to crack. For years, he had built a reputation of absolute control. Every business deal, every life, every death was decided by him. But this was something he couldn't threaten, buy, or silence. Every night he sat by Matteo's bed, his broad hands gripping the sheets like they were an enemy. He spoke softly to his son, told him stories from when he was little, and reminded him of the seaside trips they used to take before everything turned dark. The boy didn't answer. Sometimes his eyes opened, but they didn't seem to see his father at all. Elena, the Don's wife, had changed too. Her once perfect posture was gone, replaced by a trembling fragility. She'd stop mid-sentence as if forgetting where she was, and her voice carried a quiet desperation. She started to believe the illness wasn't just sickness, it was punishment. A mother's punishment for the sins of the father. The maid said she prayed longer each day, sometimes whispering the same prayer over and over until she cried herself to sleep. But the household staff had their own fears. Rumors began to spread. Some said a rival family had cursed the boy. Others said Matteo had seen something he shouldn't have, that this was the price. One of the maids, Rosa, swore she saw a black shadow standing over the boy's bed one night. When she screamed, no one believed her. She left the next morning, and her things were gone before sunrise. Don Salvador didn't care about curses. He cared about power. To him, this illness was a weakness, a sign to his enemies that he was vulnerable, and in Palermo, vulnerability could kill faster than a bullet. He doubled the guards, fired half the servants, and ordered his men to find anyone who might be behind this. His paranoia became a living thing. He suspected everyone, even those closest to him. Carlo, the janitor, noticed the changes more than anyone. He watched as the Don's men whispered in corners, as Elena stared into space during dinner, her fork untouched. He noticed the small things, the smell of burned candles from Matteo's room, the bloody tissues hidden under the boy's pillow, the way the doctors' faces paled every time they left the mansion. And every night when he mopped the same marble floors, he thought about those two words he'd whispered to himself, I can. He didn't say them again for days, but he couldn't stop thinking about them. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't even educated beyond what he'd learned sweeping school halls as a boy, but something inside him told him this wasn't a sickness science could solve. It was something else, something old, something heavy. He saw it in the boy's eyes the few times they met. There was fear there, yes, but also guilt, like Matteo knew something no one else did. One night while the doctors were arguing downstairs, Carlo saw Elena sitting alone in the chapel. The candles flickered, throwing her shadow across the wall like a broken angel. Her face was pale, almost ghostly. When she noticed him, she didn't tell him to leave. Instead, she asked quietly, "Do you believe in evil, Carlo?" He froze, he didn't know what to say. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes, Signora, I've seen it." She looked at the cross, eyes wet. "It's in this house," she whispered. "I feel it every time I breathe." Then she looked at him, her voice trembling. "My son talks in his sleep. He says things a child shouldn't know, names, places, things that haven't happened yet." Her hands shook as she crossed herself. It's like something else is inside him. Carlo said nothing, but her words burned into his mind. That night when he cleaned Matteo's room, he saw drawings scattered across the floor. The boy had drawn faces, dozens of them. Men with hollow eyes, mouths sewn shut, bodies hanging from ropes. In one corner of the page, there was a symbol drawn over and over again, a black circle with a line through it. Carlo didn't understand it, but something about it made his chest tight. He folded one drawing and slipped it into his pocket. The next day, another doctor arrived from Milan, a quiet man with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm smile. He stayed longer than most, spending hours alone with the boy. When he came out, his hands were shaking. "This is not medical," he muttered to the Don before leaving. That was the last anyone saw of him. His car never made it out of the city. By now, Don Salvador's fear had turned to fury. He began blaming his own men, accusing them of betrayal. One guard was beaten so badly that he couldn't stand. Another disappeared. The mansion felt like a trap closing in on itself, and Matteo's screams only grew worse. Alina began locking herself in her room. She refused to eat. Some nights she wandered the halls, whispering her son's name. The maids said they'd hear her at 2 or 3 in the morning, standing outside Matteo's door, humming lullabies from when he was a baby. Carlo watched her unravel. He swept the hall after her footsteps faded and see wax dripped on the floor from her candles. Once he found her kneeling in front of her son's door, whispering something over and over, something in Latin, something that made his skin crawl. And through all of it, Don Salvator sank deeper into silence. He barely slept. He stopped attending meetings. His empire began to tremble under his absence. The men who used to fear him now whispered behind his back, wondering if the great Don was losing his mind. One night, a storm rolled in from the sea. The lights flickered in the mansion, thunder echoing through its hollow corridors. Matteo's screams began again, louder than before, sharp enough to cut through the rain. Everyone rushed to his room, guards, maids, even Alina. Don Salvator stood frozen at the doorway, watching his son thrash on the bed, his eyes wide open but seeing nothing. The boy's small hand clutched the sheets, his body arching as if something invisible was pulling at him. "Stop it," Alina cried, running to him, holding his face in her hands. "Please stop." But Matteo's lips moved, and a low voice, not a child's, came from his mouth. It spoke in words no one understood, the sound rough and ancient. Every candle in the room went out at once. The thunder outside cracked, and for a moment the house felt like it was breathing. Everyone ran except Carlo. He stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. When the lights flickered back on, Matteo was still. His small chest rose and fell, slow and shallow. Alina collapsed beside him. Don Salvator's face was pale, his eyes wide but empty. After that night, everything changed. The Don forbade anyone from talking about what had happened. The staff was warned that if a single word reached outside the walls, they would disappear. But silence didn't stop the fear from spreading. Some of the servants began quitting. Those who stayed spoke in whispers, crossing themselves before entering the boy's room. Carlo couldn't sleep. The words the boy had spoken echoed in his mind. He didn't know what they meant, but he knew what he felt. Whatever this was, it wasn't sickness, it wasn't madness, it was something darker. He started staying late, long after the others went to bed. He'd clean the halls near Matteo's room, listening for any sound. Some nights, he swore he heard footsteps inside when everyone was asleep. Other nights, he saw shadows move across the doorframe. And then one evening, while mopping the marble floor, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Carlo," it whispered. He turned. Matteo was standing there, barefoot, pale as the moonlight. His eyes were wide but calm. "They can't help me," the boy said quietly, "but you can." Carlo froze, his breath caught in his chest. The boy's lips curved into a faint, trembling smile. "You said you can." Carlo didn't remember saying it aloud, but somehow Matteo knew. And in that moment, with the thunder rolling in the distance and the mansion heavy with secrets, Carlo realized there was no turning back. The line between madness and truth had already blurred. The illness was only the beginning. Something had entered that house, and it wasn't leaving without a price. The night the crime unfolded, the air in Palermo felt different, thick, unmoving, as if even the wind was holding its breath. Inside the De Luca mansion, every sound seemed too loud. The creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the old clock in the hall, the faint hum of electricity, everything carried a weight it hadn't before. It was almost midnight when Carlo decided to go up to Matteo's room one last time. He told himself he only wanted to check that everything was clean, that the hallway was polished for the morning. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something had been calling him back to that room every night since the storm. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't curiosity, it was compulsion. A pull he didn't understand but couldn't resist. The boy's words haunted him. "You said you can." The house was mostly asleep. A few guards remained at their posts, half awake, their radios crackling with static. The Don was in his office, lights still on, staring at a pile of reports that meant nothing. His empire was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. His mind was too heavy, his heart too tired. Alina, sedated by the doctor, was in bed, murmuring prayers even in her sleep. Carlo moved quietly through the corridor, his old shoes brushing against the marble. The door to Matteo's room was slightly open, just a sliver of darkness visible inside. He hesitated, then pushed it open. The first thing that hit him was the smell, cold, metallic, and sharp. The kind of smell that didn't belong in a child's room. The curtains were drawn and the moonlight spilled across the bed. Matteo was sitting upright, staring at the wall. His small frame looked fragile against the enormous headboard. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was no fear this time. Only calm, too much calm. Carlo's voice was soft, unsure. "Matteo." The boy turned his head slowly. His voice was distant, hollow. "You came." Carlo took a step closer. "You shouldn't be awake, ragazzo. You need to rest." Matteo tilted his head, his lips twitching into something that looked like a smile but felt wrong. "I don't sleep anymore. He doesn't let me." Carlo froze. "Who?" The boy's gaze shifted to the corner of the room. Carlo followed it. For a moment he saw nothing. Then, just for a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement, a shadow darker than the rest, clinging to the wall like smoke. The hairs on his neck stood up. "Matteo," he whispered, "what do you see?" The boy didn't answer. He slid off the bed, bare feet silent against the cold floor. He walked toward the window and touched the glass, his breath fogging it. Then in slow, deliberate strokes, he drew that same black circle with a line through it, the symbol from his drawings. Carlo's chest tightened. "Matteo, don't." The boy turned suddenly, eyes wide and voice trembling. "It's not me. He's inside. He said I have to finish it." Carlo grabbed his shoulders. "Who said that? Matteo, listen to me." The lights flickered. A deep hum filled the room, low and vibrating through the walls. The air grew cold, biting against Carlo's skin. Matteo's body began to shake violently. His eyes rolled back, his small hands clawing at his chest as if trying to tear something out. Carlo panicked. "No, no, stay with me, boy." He held him, but the child's body convulsed harder. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and suddenly a loud shatter filled the room. The mirror by the dresser cracked down the middle, glass spilling across the floor like ice. Footsteps thundered in the hallway. The door burst open, and Don Salvator stormed in, gun in hand, with 2 guards behind him. His eyes darted to his son, then to Carlo holding him. "What are you doing?" the Don shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Carlo tried to speak, but the boy suddenly went still. The silence that followed was deafening. Matteo's body sagged in Carlo's arms, limp and motionless. His eyes were half open, staring at nothing. Elena appeared at the doorway, her nightgown clinging to her trembling frame. "Matteo!" Her voice cracked. She ran forward, pushing Carlo aside, gathering her son into her arms. "Matteo, look at me, Tesoro. Please wake up." Carlo stepped back, his hands shaking. Something was. "Shut up," the Don roared. He pointed the gun at Carlo, eyes wild, veins standing out against his neck. "What did you do to my son?" Carlo raised his hands. "No, Don, he was sick. He wasn't himself." "Liar," the Don spat, his voice trembling. He turned to his men. "Take him outside." Elena screamed. "Salvator, stop. He didn't do this." But the Don was beyond reason. His grief had turned into something feral, something that needed to destroy. "He touched my boy. He killed him." The guards grabbed Carlo, dragging him toward the door. He didn't fight. He couldn't. He looked one last time at the boy, his small hand hanging limp, his head resting against his mother's chest. A child who had once laughed in the garden is now silent forever. Outside, the storm had started again. Rain pounded against the stone steps as they dragged Carlo through the courtyard. Lightning flashed, lighting up the statues and the iron gates. The guards threw him to the ground, mud splashing across his face. Carlo didn't beg, he just looked up at the sky, the rain mixing with his tears. "He wasn't alone," he whispered. "There was something in that house, you'll see." The Don stood over him, gun steady despite the tremor in his hand. For a moment he hesitated. His face was twisted in grief and rage, his mind torn between vengeance and disbelief. Then, with a breath that sounded more like a sob, he pulled the trigger. The sound echoed through the courtyard, sharp and final. Carlo's body went still, his head dropping to the side. The rain kept falling, washing away the blood into the cracks of the stones. Inside, Elena's screams filled the mansion. She refused to let go of Matteo, rocking his small body as if warmth could bring him back. The guards stood frozen, unsure what to do. One of them turned away, crossing himself. Don Salvator walked back inside, drenched and shaking. He dropped the gun on the floor, his breathing ragged. For the first time in his life, the Don of Palermo looked powerless. He sank to his knees beside the bed, his hands trembling as he touched his son's cold cheek. Elena's eyes met his. They were empty now, hollowed out by grief. "You killed the wrong man," she whispered. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The words hit him harder than the gunshot. As the night dragged on, the house grew quiet again. The rain faded. The guards carried Carlo's body away before dawn, burying him in the garden behind the cypress trees. No one spoke his name again. But something in that house had shifted. The walls seemed to hum softly, the air heavy with a presence no one could see. In the silence of Matteo's room, the cracked mirror caught a flicker of movement, a faint reflection of a boy's smile. And in the morning, when Alina finally gathered the strength to open her eyes, she saw it, drawn on the fogged window pane above her son's bed. The black circle with a line through it, fresh as if someone had just drawn it. She screamed until her voice broke, and somewhere deep in the house, the air seemed to whisper back. The morning after the murder, Palermo woke under a gray, heavy sky. The rain had stopped, but the city felt damp with unease. Word spread faster than the Don's men could silence it. No one knew the full story, but everyone whispered. The De Luca boy was dead, and the Don had killed the janitor in the middle of the night. The mansion stood quieter than it had ever been. Guards spoke in low voices, avoiding the west wing entirely. The maids worked quickly, eyes lowered, afraid to linger in any one room too long. The scent of bleach and candle wax filled the air, trying and failing to cover the smell of death that clung to the walls. Alina hadn't left her son's room. She sat beside Matteo's bed, her body still wrapped in the same nightgown from the night before, her hair tangled and wet from tears. The doctor came twice that morning, but she wouldn't speak to him. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't even look at her husband. She just stared at Matteo's still face, stroking his hair, whispering words only a mother could understand. Don Salvator stayed in his office with the curtains drawn. His empire, once run with cold precision, was now falling apart. Meetings were canceled, deals left unfinished. His men didn't know what to do without orders, and the rivals he once kept at bay began circling like vultures. The Don, who had commanded fear from the entire city, was now a ghost of himself, silent, hollow, and dangerous in a different way. He told himself Carlo had been guilty, that he'd done what any father would do. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the janitor's face in the rain. No fear, no anger, just sorrow. He wasn't alone, Carlo had said. The words replayed again and again until they echoed louder than Matteo's screams. By the second night, the Don had stopped sleeping altogether. He wandered the halls like a restless spirit, drinking until his hands shook. He passed Matteo's room once but didn't go in. The door was slightly open, and through the gap he could see Alina still sitting there in the dark, unmoving. He turned away. Outside the mansion, the city began to buzz with rumors. Palermo was a city that lived on whispers, and this one spread like wildfire. They said the Don's boy had been cursed. Some said he'd been possessed. Others claimed it was punishment for the lives the De Lucases had destroyed over the years. The more superstitious crossed themselves when they spoke the family's name. The newspapers tried to publish the story, but most were stopped before reaching the stands. Still, fragments made their way through: the mysterious illness, the string of missing doctors, the janitor's sudden disappearance. People read between the lines. The legend of the De Luca family took on a darker shape. Fear turned to disgust. Power turned to pity. Inside the mansion, guilt began to rot what little was left of the family. Alina's grief twisted into something colder. She stopped crying. She stopped praying. The candles around Matteo's bed burned down to puddles of wax that hardened across the wood. The servant said she didn't blink for hours, her eyes fixed on the boy's face as if waiting for him to breathe again. One morning she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, too calm. "You killed him," she said to her husband. Don Salvator didn't answer. "You killed the only innocent soul in this house," she whispered, "and now he's gone and we're still here." He tried to tell her that he'd done what was necessary, that Carlo had touched the boy, that he had to protect their family. But even as he said it, his words sounded hollow. There was no conviction in them, only fear. Alina turned away from him. "You can't protect us from this," she said softly. "You can't threaten what's already inside the walls." That night she locked her door. The days blurred together. The Don's men reported more strange happenings, lights flickering, doors slamming on their own, voices heard in the hallways late at night. One guard quit without explanation after claiming he saw a shadow of a small boy standing by the garden where Carlo had been buried. By the third week, the Don stopped eating. He sat in his office surrounded by unfinished glasses of whiskey and cigarette smoke. He stared at the phone for hours, wanting to call someone, anyone, but who could he trust now? The silence of the house pressed against him like a weight. One evening, as he stared out the window, he thought he saw movement near the cypress trees. A figure, small and still, standing by the spot where they'd buried Carlo. The Don rubbed his eyes, but the figure didn't disappear. It just turned its head slowly toward the mansion before vanishing into the mist. That night he heard footsteps outside his door. Light ones, barefoot, he froze, every muscle tensing. The sound stopped right outside, then a soft knock. He waited, heart pounding. "Papa." The voice was faint, but he knew it instantly. Matteo. The glass of whiskey slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. He threw open the door. The hallway was empty, only silence, only shadows. He stood there trembling before collapsing against the doorframe. His chest heaved, his breath coming out in sharp gasps. He wanted to believe he was drunk, hallucinating, but deep down he knew. This house wasn't empty. It never would be again. By the end of the month, the De Luca mansion was barely functioning. Half the staff had quit. The doctors stopped visiting. The Don's business partners stopped calling. He was isolated, surrounded by his own walls, haunted by his own power. Elena left one morning before dawn. She didn't take anything with her except a small wooden cross from Matteo's nightstand. No one saw where she went. Some said she joined a convent. Others said she walked into the sea. Don Salvator never tried to find her. He couldn't. He barely left his office anymore. He spent his days staring at the drawings they'd found in Matteo's room, those black circles with the lines through them, covering page after page. He pinned them to the walls, trying to make sense of them, trying to find meaning in the chaos. But the nights were the worst. He'd hear whispers echoing through the house, soft and childlike, sometimes laughter, sometimes crying, sometimes his own name. Once he woke to find his office door open and one of Matteo's drawings placed on his desk, one that hadn't been there before. It showed three figures, a man, a woman, and a boy standing between them. The man's face was smeared with black. The boy's eyes were hollow. Beneath it, in Matteo's shaky handwriting, were three words: "We are here." After that, the Don stopped leaving the room altogether. His men stopped knocking. The house became a tomb for everything it had buried: power, love, guilt, and ghosts that refused to rest. Months later, when the estate lawyer finally entered the mansion to handle unfinished affairs, he found the Don's office locked from the inside. They broke the door down and found him sitting in his chair, head slumped forward, gun still in his hand. A single shot to the heart. On the desk beside the gun was a piece of paper with shaky handwriting. Just one sentence: he wasn't alone. The city mourned, but not with grief. Palermo didn't cry for its fallen king. People whispered prayers not for his soul, but for peace, so that his shadow might finally leave them be. The De Luca Empire dissolved overnight, its men scattering like ash in the wind. But the mansion still stood on the hill, windows dark, gates locked. Locals say on stormy nights, the lights flicker in the west wing. Some claim they hear a boy's laughter in the distance, followed by a man's sobs. Most don't dare go near it anymore, because in Palermo they still say the same thing, quietly, crossing themselves as they pass the hill. The De Luca curse doesn't sleep. By the time the court case came to its end, the city that once worshipped the Rixai family had grown silent. The same people who used to bow their heads when Carlo Rixai walked past were now watching him sit motionless in a courtroom, his face pale and hollow. The man who once made others tremble with a single phone call now looked like a ghost of himself, broken, stripped of power, sitting beneath a system he couldn't buy, threaten, or manipulate. The janitor, Luca, the man who had changed everything, sat quietly a few rows behind. He didn't come for revenge or attention. He came to see the end of a story that had nearly cost him his own life. In the days after the truth surfaced, the world learned more than it ever expected. Carlo had used his wealth and influence to cover his son's condition, not because he was afraid for his child, but because he was afraid of weakness. The illness had been genetic, a result of medical negligence hidden for years to protect the family's image. The doctors who failed to diagnose Marco were handpicked, forced to follow Rixai's orders rather than their own ethics. It was a crime of pride disguised as love, one that spiraled into chaos. When Marco died, the illusion collapsed. The media devoured every detail: the Mafia's hold over the hospital, the bribed physicians, the silence of those who knew. And in the middle of it all stood Luca, the janitor who had seen what others refused to see. For years, he had been invisible, the man cleaning the floors while doctors argued, while nurses whispered. No one looked at him twice. But in the end, he became the one voice that broke the empire's silence. Carlo Rixai was sentenced to 15 years in prison for obstruction, bribery, and corruption in the medical field. For a man like him, the punishment wasn't about time, it was about power. Losing control was his greatest fear. And as he sat in his cold, narrow cell, the walls echoed not with violence or threats, but with memories of his son's laughter, the one thing he couldn't protect or own. The doctors who cooperated with his cover-ups were stripped of their licenses, some serving time for malpractice. Their downfall became a warning to others. Power and medicine should never intertwine. The hospital itself was placed under federal watch, its reputation stained beyond repair. Families who once trusted its marble halls and golden plaques now crossed the street to avoid even looking at it. Luca disappeared from the public eye soon after. When reporters tried to find him, they learned he had returned to his small coastal town, living quietly fixing boats at a dock. He refused interviews, saying only, "I didn't save him, I just told the truth." His words haunted the news cycles for months, a reminder of how truth doesn't always heal, but it always changes things. The Rixai family mansion was sold. Its marble floors, once filled with laughter and arrogance, stood empty. Neighbors said that at night you could still hear faint echoes, a piano playing somewhere in the dark, notes that stopped halfway like a child's song unfinished. Justice was served, at least on paper, but the people who lived through it knew better. Justice in this story was not a balance, it was a wound. Carlo lost his son, his name, and his power. Luca lost his peace. The doctors lost their careers, and the city lost something too, its faith in what it thought was safe and untouchable. The story forced people to question the thin line between care and control, love and possession. Carlo had believed that protecting his family meant owning every piece of their lives, even their pain. But power built on fear never lasts, it only isolates. His downfall wasn't just about corruption. It was about pride, the kind that blinds a man until he can't see the difference between saving someone and destroying them. In the end, the case changed the laws in Italy. A new policy made it illegal for private influence to interfere with medical decision-making in public institutions. It wasn't perfect, but it was something, a small step toward accountability. But for those who had lived through it, especially Luca, the change didn't erase what had happened. He sometimes walked along the pier at night, looking at the sea, wondering what might have been if he had spoken sooner or if someone else had. The sound of the waves reminded him of the sterile hum of hospital machines, of the boy's weak breathing, of the whisper that changed everything. Carlo Rixai died 3 years into his sentence. Heart failure, the papers said. No family visits, no flowers. His death went unnoticed until a journalist mentioned it in passing, buried between political scandals and celebrity gossip. The irony was cruel. A man who controlled life and death for so long finally left the world quietly with no one to mourn him. Luca found out months later. He didn't say much, just stared at the water and whispered, maybe now he has found peace. The story of the Rixis became more than a headline. It became a legend, a modern parable about the cost of pride and silence. In every hospital where the janitor walks unseen, people still remember. Sometimes the one who cleans up the mess is the only one brave enough to speak the truth. And in the end, that truth was all that remained, fragile, painful, but pure.